Welcome to my channel.
The mist over Lochdub was as thick as potato soup and twice as cold. It clung to the heather, swallowed the craggy peaks of the surrounding mountains, and turned the Scottish Highlands into a damp, white void. For Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, it was an absolutely perfect morning. Perfect, because not even the most demanding superior officer back at headquarters in Strathbane could expect a man to patrol in this soup. Instead of sitting in the police station waiting for the telephone to ring, Hamish was crouched beside a dark, peaty burn miles from the village. His lanky frame was bundled against the chill, his flaming red hair stuffed beneath a pulled-down cap. Beside him, his mongrel dog, Lugs, sat with ears pricked, staring intently at the water. Hamish had a piece of string in his hand, a hook, and a hopeful expression. A magnificent silver salmon was just hovering near his bait. Hamish held his breath, his stomach already anticipating a grand, free dinner on his small stove. Then, the profound silence was shattered by a booming, exasperated voice cutting through the fog like a rusty saw. "I don't care if they've walked this path for 100 years, Samantha. I bought the land, and putting up a 6-foot fence." Hamish winced. The salmon shot away into the murky depths, taking Hamish's dinner with it. He sighed, slowly pulling in his empty line. Through the swirling white mist, 2 figures blundered over the rise. They hadn't driven the track here, was far too boggy for any motorcar, but had marched straight up the hill on foot. They were decked out in blindingly clean, neon-coloured hiking gear of the sort sold in expensive London boutiques to people who thought the wild meant a slightly uneven pavement. The speaker was a stout, red-faced man swinging a titanium walking stick as if trying to beat the fog into submission. "And that village, absolute squalor." The grocer stared at me as if I'd asked for moon rocks when I requested organic avocados. "I'll have to have everything shipped up." Hamish slowly stood up. He had no desire whatsoever to announce himself as the local law enforcement. That would only invite endless complaints about property lines, local bylaws, and trespassing. Instead, he let his shoulders droop, adopted his most vacant expression, and let his jaw hang slightly slack. "Mornin'," Hamish drawled, making himself sound as slow and thick as the weather. The man jumped, brandishing his high-tech walking stick. "Good Lord! Where did you spring from? You shouldn't skulk about in the fog like that. Just looking for lost sheep." Hamish lied smoothly, his Highland accent suddenly twice as thick. "Awful soupy out today, sir." "You'll be the new owner of the old MacGregor tract, then. Arthur Pendleton," the man barked, puffing out his chest so far his waterproof jacket creaked. "And yes, though it's the Pendleton estate now. I expect you locals to stick to the main roads from now on. No more wandering across my moor." "Aye, sir. Right you are, sir," Hamish said, nodding his head like a subservient, dim-witted peasant. "Well, just be keeping to the mud, then. Have a grand walk." Arthur sniffed dismissively, gesturing for his shivering companion to follow. "Come along, Samantha. Let's see if that dismal hotel serves a decent cup of coffee." "I doubt it." Hamish watched them stomp off into the mist, ruining several patches of delicate wild thyme with their heavy boots. His stomach gave a hollow rumble. A Sassenach with too much money, a bad temper, and a desperate desire to fence off the Highlands. It was a recipe for absolute disaster in a place like Lochdub, where grudges were held longer than the winter snow. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish murmured, abandoning his fishing spot. "Looks like we'll be mooching a bacon roll off the hotel today after all. Best we keep our heads down, that one is going to cause a stir." He shoved his hands deep into his pockets and ambled back toward the village, deeply annoyed that his peaceful morning had been ruined, and already exhausted by the sheer effort of having to pretend to be stupid before breakfast. By the time Hamish and Lugs reached the waterfront, the thick morning fog was thinning, torn apart by a biting breeze. The sky began to clear into a sharp, crystalline blue. Hamish pushed open the oak door of the Lochdub Hotel, immediately hit by the glorious scent of frying bacon. The dining room was empty, save for the proprietor, Mr. Maxwell, fiercely polishing a glass. Hamish slid onto a stool, letting out a long, pathetic sigh. His shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the entire world rested upon his uniform. Lugs collapsed at his feet with a sympathetic whine. "Rough morning, Hamish?" Mr. Maxwell asked, reaching for a thick white mug. "You look as though you've walked all the way to Strathbane and back." "Worse," Hamish said mournfully, wrapping his cold fingers around the steaming mug. "I've just met the new laird of the MacGregor tract, an Englishman named Pendleton. He's talking about fences and keeping locals off the moor." Maxwell scoffed, sliding a generously filled bacon roll across the counter. "I heard. He was in here last night complaining our single malt was too peaty and demanding we import London gin. He's already threatened to sue old Mrs. Mac Farlane over her wandering chickens. The man is making enemies faster than a fox in a henhouse. Hamish took a massive bite of the bacon roll, chewing thoughtfully. Well, the Highlands have a way of humbling those who try to fence them in. Hell learn or hell leave. He was just lifting the coffee to his lips, anticipating an hour of undisturbed, quiet digestion, when the heavy oak door flew open with a violent crash. Heavy wood hit the wall. Willie Mac Lean, a local shepherd known for having a fondness for other people's deer, stood in the doorway. He was completely out of breath, his face pale beneath its permanent layer of grime, his woolen cap clutched tightly in trembling hands. "Hamish," Willie gasped, his eyes wide with shock. "You'd best come quick. It's that new Sassenach fellow, the loud one." Hamish froze, his mug inches from his mouth. He closed his eyes, mourning the loss of his peaceful morning and the quiet digestion of his breakfast. He set the mug down with a reluctant clink. "What about him, Willie? Has he fallen into a bog and ruined his fancy trousers?" "No, Hamish. He's dead." Willie swallowed hard. Well, it's an awful strange sight, so it is." Hamish let out another profound sigh, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He stood up, adjusting his tunic so it hung just a bit more sloppily over his lean frame. "Right. Lead the way, Willie. Come on, lugs." The biting breeze had fully chased away the fog by the time they reached the rocky incline, just past the old Mac-Gregor boundary line. The sky was now a brilliant, cloudless blue, making the grim scene before them stand out in sharp, absurd detail. Arthur Pendleton was dead, hopelessly entangled in a massive, unspooled roll of bright orange snow fencing. It was wrapped around his legs and torso in a chaotic web. More bizarrely, his titanium walking stick had been twisted into the heavy mesh directly across his throat, acting as a crude, effective garrote. He lay flat on his back in soft peat, his waterproof jacket smeared with mud, his face a horrifying shade of purple. "I found him just like this," Willie whispered, keeping a healthy distance. "Looks like he tripped and tangled himself up in his own rubbish, doesn't it?" Hamish shoved his hands deep into his pockets and slouched forward, his face a mask of lazy indifference. To Willie, the policeman looked bored, merely staring at the ugly orange plastic ruining the natural landscape. But behind his sleepy hazel eyes, Hamish's mind was racing. He noticed the mud on Pendleton's boots was completely dry. He hadn't walked far in the damp peat before falling. Furthermore, the orange fencing was tied in a specific, complicated knot near the walking stick, a knot no man could accidentally tie while falling. It was a knot used by local fishermen to secure heavy nets in rough tides. "Willie," Hamish finally drawled, scratching his head. "Looks like a terrible, clumsy accident." He paused, looking at the corpse. "But I suppose I'd better call headquarters anyway. DCI Blair is going to be absolutely furious about having to drive all the way out here on a Sunday." Hamish kicked a loose stone into the heather, deeply irritated. He knew exactly what was coming. Blair would arrive, shout at everyone, and arrest the first local he saw. And Hamish was going to have to do actual police work to stop him. Hamish did not have long to wait before the harsh realities of the Strathbane Criminal Investigation Department intruded upon the crisp Highland morning. After sending a trembling Willie Mac Lean back to the village with strict orders to keep his mouth shut, a completely futile gesture in a place where gossip travelled faster than the speed of light, Hamish sat on a nearby boulder. The sky had cleared into a brilliant, aching blue, the biting wind rustling the dry heather. Lugs whined softly, leaning against Hamish's worn boots. The policeman merely offered the dog a piece of leftover bacon from his pocket, his eyes fixed on the chaotic tangle of orange plastic and the unfortunate Arthur Pendleton. He noted exactly where the heavy boots of the deceased had disturbed the peat, and more importantly, where they had not. The fisherman's not securing the titanium stick glared at him like a beacon, but Hamish meticulously scrubbed any sign of comprehension from his face as the distant, grinding roar of engines echoed up the glen. Two standard issue, mud-splattered police rovers came violently bouncing over the rutted track, entirely unsuited for the boggy terrain, but driven with aggressive impatience. They came to a grinding halt just short of the boundary line, kicking up a shower of loose gravel and dry earth. The doors opened, and Detective Chief Inspector Blair heaved his bulk out of the passenger side of the lead vehicle. Blair's face was already a dangerous shade of magenta. His breathing laboured from the mere effort of stepping out of the car. He smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke, cheap peppermints, and perpetual rage. Flanked by his perpetually exhausted sergeant, Jimmy Anderson, Blair cast a look of absolute loathing at the sweeping mountains, the clear sky, and finally at the lanky constable slouching by the boulder. "Macbeth, you gangling idiot!" Blair bellowed, his voice sending a flock of crows scattering from a nearby stunted pine. "Look at you, sitting there like a brainless scarecrow while there's a corpse on the moor. Stand up straight, man." Hamish unfurled himself slowly, letting his shoulders drop and his jaw go slightly slack. He pulled his peaked cap a fraction lower. "Mornin', Mr. Blair. Grand day for it, once the fog lifted." "Shut up, Macbeth!" Blair snarled, stomping heavily toward the body. With every step, his thick-soled shoes crushed the delicate surrounding flora and obliterated any subtle footprints the killer might have left in the drier patches of soil. Hamish winced internally, but kept his expression perfectly vacant. "The control room said you reported an accident. A man tangled in a fence. Are you entirely blind, or just naturally stupid?" "Well, sir," Hamish drawled, his accent thickening into an exaggerated Highland lilt. He was a terribly clumsy sort of Sassenach. "I met him just this morning. Marching in the fog, he was. I thought perhaps Head tripped over his own wire and got himself in a fankle." Blair let out a sharp, barking laugh of pure condescension, turning to his sergeant. "Did you hear that, Jimmy? The Highland half-wit thinks a man accidentally tied his own walking stick around his neck and strangled himself. It's a wonder you remember how to breathe, Macbeth." Blair pointed a thick, accusatory finger at the corpse. "This is murder, plain as the nose on your ugly face. Someone hated this rich nuisance enough to choke the life out of him." Hamish merely blinked, looking suitably chastened. "Murder, you say? Mister. Liar. My. Who would do a terrible thing like that? That's for real detectives to find out, not village bobbies who spend their days poaching salmon." Blair snapped, crouching awkwardly near the body. He completely ignored the complex, nautical nature of the knot securing the stick, his eyes instead locking onto the bright orange fencing. "Who found him?" "Willie Mac Lean, sir. The shepherd." Blair's eyes lit up with malicious triumph. "Maclean, that filthy thieving poacher. The man has a record as long as my arm for stealing sheep and trespassing. And here we have a wealthy landowner putting up fences to keep the likes of Mac Lean out. It's obvious. Mac Lean confronts him, things get out of hand, and he strings him up with his own rubbish. Willie's a bit small to be wrestling a big fellow like Mr. Pendleton, sir," Hamish offered mildly, though he knew Willie was entirely innocent of anything worse than lifting a few trout. "I don't pay you to think, Macbeth. In fact, I'd prefer it if you didn't," Blair shouted, standing up and brushing peat from his trousers in disgust. "Jimmy, get a team down to the village and drag Mac Lean in for questioning. He's our prime suspect." He rounded Hamish with a sneer. "As for you, keep your clumsy feet off my crime scene. Go stand down by the main road and direct the traffic." "There is no traffic, Mr. Blair," Hamish said softly. "It's a dead-end track. Then direct the bloody sheep." Blair roared, his face turning a shade closer to purple. "Just stay out of my way while I solve this case." Hamish tipped his cap, a picture of lazy obedience. "Right you are, sir. I'll just go and keep the road clear." He turned away, whistling softly for Lugs to follow. As he ambled back toward Lochdub, leaving Blair to trample whatever evidence remained, Hamish felt a familiar, quiet resolve settling over him. Blair was going to lock up poor Willie Mac Lean by nightfall if left to his own devices. That meant Hamish would have to solve the murder himself, entirely by accident, and without anyone noticing he was doing it. His first stop, he decided, wouldn't be the main road. It would be Mrs. Wellington's kitchen at the manse, where a cup of strong tea and the finest village gossip were always waiting. The walk down into Lochdub was a pleasant one, completely unbothered by anything resembling traffic. The crisp, biting wind had scrubbed the sky to a flawless azure, and the waters of the loch sparkled with deceptive innocence. Hamish took his time, allowing Lugs to investigate several promising rabbit holes along the verges. There was no sense in rushing. DCI Blair was currently occupied trampling the moor and shouting at his long-suffering sergeant, which meant the village was, for a brief window, Hamish to quietly investigate. He approached the minister's manse via the back garden, expertly avoiding a loose paving stone that he knew clattered loudly. He knocked softly on the heavy kitchen door and opened it without waiting for an answer. The air inside was instantly enveloping, thick with the heavenly aroma of baking bread and strong Darjeeling tea. "Wipe those boots, Hamish Macbeth, or you'll be scrubbing this linoleum yourself," came the commanding voice of Mrs. Wellington. The minister's wife was a formidable woman with an iron perm, a gaze that could peel paint, and an unparalleled network of village informants. She stood by the Arga stove, brandishing a wooden spoon like a scepter. I am spotless, Mrs. Wellington. Hamish lied mildly, wiping his boots with exaggerated care on the welcome mat. He removed his cap, running a hand through his unruly red hair, and slumped into a wooden chair at the scrubbed pine table. Lugs immediately curled into a hopeful ball beneath his feet. It's a bitter cold today. I don't suppose there's a drop of tea going spare for a poor frozen policeman. Mrs. Wellington sniffed, though she was already reaching for a second cup and a plate of freshly baked scones. I suppose you're hiding from that loudmouth Blair. The whole village heard his cars tearing through the high street. Disgraceful noise on a Sunday. She set the steaming cup and plate before Hamish. So, the new Englishman managed to get himself killed, did he? It took less time than I expected. Hamish paused with a scone halfway to his mouth, looking at her with wide, innocent eyes. Now, who said anything about him being killed? Mr. Blair thinks it's murder. Aye, but it looked like a terrible, clumsy accident to me. Tangled in his own orange fencing, the poor soul. Accident, my foot, Mrs. Wellington retorted, sitting opposite him. Arthur Pendleton was an arrogant boor who spent his only 48 hours in Lochdub, making sure everyone despised him. I heard Blair is already sending his goons after Willie Mac Lean. Mr. Blair does like an obvious target, Hamish mumbled around a mouthful of buttery scone. Though I can't see Willie stringing a man up. He'd just steal the man's wallet and run away. Exactly. Willie is a sneak, not a strangler. Mrs. Wellington leaned closer, her voice dropping into the conspiratorial register she reserved for top-tier gossip. If your Mr. Blair had an ounce of sense, which he doesn't, he'd be looking at the harbour. Hamish kept his face perfectly blank, sipping his tea. The harbour? Did Mr. Pendleton take a sudden interest in boating? He took an interest in ruining livelihoods, she said grimly. Yesterday evening, before his ill-fated walk this morning, Pendleton marched down to the pier. He cornered Ewan Campbell as he was unloading his catch. Pendleton told Ewan that he was buying the mooring rights to that entire stretch of the shore and that Ewan's stinking little tubs were ruining the aesthetic of his new estate. Threatened to have the boats impounded if Ewan didn't relocate by the end of the month. Hamish stopped chewing. Ewan Campbell, a man who spent his entire life working with ropes, nets, and heavy tides. A man who could tie a complicated fisherman's knot in the dark with freezing fingers. Ewan has a fierce temper when pushed, Hamish noted mildly, brushing a crumb from his tunic. Did they come to blows? Nearly. Ewan had a fillet knife in his hand at the time, and he looked ready to use it. But Pendleton's companion dragged him. That poor, mousy woman in the bright pink hiking coat. Samantha, I think she's called. Mrs. Wellington's eyes narrowed. And let me tell you, Hamish, she didn't look like a grieving relative or a happy secretary. She looked terrified. And I saw her slipping out of the hotel at the crack of dawn this morning, long before Pendleton went marching up the moor. Did you now? Hamish murmured. He finished his tea in one long gulp. He had a suspect with a motive and the specific skill set to commit the crime, and a mysterious companion who was wandering about at the exact time of the murder. And Blair was entirely focused on the wrong man. Hamish stood up, stretching his lanky arms. Well, Mrs. Wellington, your baking is a blessing, as always. But I suppose I'd best go and direct that traffic like Mr. Blair ordered. Can't have the sheep causing a tailback. He tipped his cap and stepped out the back door, his lazy demeanour dissolving the moment the wood clicked shut behind him. He needed to find Samantha before the bumbling detectives from Strathbane realised she was missing. Hamish paused at the edge of Mrs. Wellington's garden, letting the biting wind ruffle his red hair before he settled his peaked cap back into place. To anyone watching from a window along the waterfront, the village policeman appeared to be doing absolutely nothing of consequence, perhaps contemplating a nap against the nearest stone wall. In reality, his mind was actively mapping the village. If Samantha had left the hotel at the crack of dawn and returned before Arthur Pendleton marched to his death, she would be freezing, exhausted, and likely in desperate need of a quiet place to panic. She wouldn't be in the main dining room, not with the morning gossip mill already churning out wild theories alongside the porridge. He ambled down the high street, his boots crunching softly on the frost-hardened earth. Lugs trotted faithfully at his heels, occasionally pausing to sniff a frozen patch of weeds. The Lochdub Hotel loomed ahead, its Victorian facade looking particularly severe in the sharp morning light. As Hamish slipped through the heavy front doors, the atmosphere inside had drastically changed from the peaceful, bacon-scented haven of an hour ago. Two of Blair's uniformed constables from Strathbane were loudly demanding coffee from a highly agitated Mr. Maxwell, who looked ready to batter them with a silver serving tray. Hamish sidled along the wood-panelled wall, melting into the shadows of the corridor like a ghost in an ill-fitting blue uniform. He bypassed the noisy reception and slipped toward the rear of the building, where a dilapidated, glass-paned conservatory overlooked the dark waters of the loch. It was notoriously draughty, smelled faintly of damp potting soil, and was the last place any sane guest would sit on a freezing Sunday morning. Sure enough, huddled in a wicker chair beneath a dying fern was Samantha. She was wrapped tightly in her glaringly bright pink hiking coat, her knees pulled up to her chest, clutching a delicate porcelain teacup with trembling hands. Her face was pale, devoid of the forced, polite smile she had worn on the moor. Up close, Hamish could see her eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted, darting nervously at every creak of the old glass panes. Hamish let his footsteps fall a little heavier so as not to startle her, adopting a soft, bumbling smile as he approached. "Awful draughty in here, miss," he murmured, his Highland accent thick and soothing, like warm honey poured over gravel. "You'll catch your death sitting by these old windows." Samantha flinched violently, splashing tea onto her coat. She stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and recognition. You're the policeman from the hill. The one looking for sheep. Aye, that's me. Constable Macbeth, Hamish said, pulling up a creaking wicker chair and sitting at a respectful distance. He removed his cap and placed it on his knee, looking at her with mild bovine innocence. "I heard the terrible news about Mr. Pendleton. A tragic accident, that. Tripping over his own fencing. It must be a dreadful shock for you." Samantha let out a choked, bitter laugh, the sound harsh in the quiet conservatory. Accident? Arthur never had an accident in his life. He calculated every step he took, and he didn't trip. Someone put that horrid orange plastic around him on purpose. She leaned forward, lowering her voice to a frantic whisper. "He was going up there to catch them, you know. He said he had proof." Hamish tilted his head, his face a picture of polite confusion, though his pulse quickened. "Proof of what, miss? Was someone stealing his sheep? Though, mind you, he hadn't bought any sheep yet. Trespassers. Poachers. He hated them," she spat, shivering violently. "He set up a trail camera on the boundary line last night. He wanted to catch that awful fisherman, the one who threatened him at the harbour sneaking onto the estate. Arthur woke up early, checked the camera feed on his mobile phone, and went absolutely white. He said, 'I've got the filthy thief dead to rights,' and marched out into the fog." Hamish slowly digested this. Pendleton hadn't just gone for a walk to admire the mist, he had gone to confront someone he had caught on camera, and that someone had strangled him with his own titanium cane. "Well now," Hamish said slowly, scratching his chin. "That's a very helpful detail, miss. Did he take his mobile phone with him then?" "Of course he did. He never went anywhere without it. He was going to use it to call the police the moment he confronted the man." Samantha's voice cracked. "But the detectives from the city, the loud ones, they didn't find a phone on him. I heard them shouting about it in the lobby. The killer took it, didn't they? They took it to destroy the evidence." Before Hamish could delve deeper into exactly where Samantha herself had been during the early hours of the morning, the conservatory doors were thrown violently open. The glass panes rattled in their wooden frames. DCI Blair stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his face a mask of aggressive triumph. Sergeant Anderson loomed miserably behind him. "There you are!" Blair bellowed, pointing a thick, nicotine-stained finger at Samantha. "I need you to identify a suspect, miss. We've got the local poacher in custody, and I want this wrapped up before lunch." Blair's gaze finally snapped down to Hamish, his eyes narrowing to angry slits. "Macbeth, what in the name of hell are you skulking about here? I told you to direct the bloody sheep. Just offering my condolences to the bereaved, Mr. Blair," Hamish drawled, standing up slowly and making himself appear as clumsy and useless as possible. He slunked his shoulders and let his gaze drift toward the ceiling. "She was just telling me how much Mr. Pendleton liked taking photographs. A real hobbyist he was. I don't care if he painted watercolours." Blair roared. "Get out of my sight, Macbeth, before I put you on suspension." Hamish tipped his cap, a mild, vacant smile on his face. He shuffled past Blair, his head bowed. But as he stepped out into the crisp Highland air, his mind was razor-sharp. The killer had taken the phone to hide their identity. But they hadn't known about the trail camera hidden somewhere in the heather. Hamish needed to find that camera before Blair's heavy boots crushed it, and before the killer realized their mistake and went back to finish the job. Stepping out of the Lochdub Hotel, Hamish did not turn toward the police station, where DCI Blair was no doubt preparing to bully a confession out of poor Willie MacLean. Instead, he slouched in the opposite direction, whistling a tuneless melody, the very picture of a village bobby with nothing more pressing on his mind than his next cup of tea. He ambled past the grocer's, tipped his hat to the baker's wife, and then, the moment he slipped behind the old stone kirk, his demeanour shifted entirely. The lazy stoop vanished from his shoulders. His stride lengthened, eating up the frosty ground, as he and Lugs made a beeline back toward the Mac-Gregor tract. The sun was high now, casting long, sharp shadows across the heather. The morning fog was a distant memory, replaced by a biting wind that carried the scent of peat and salt water. Hamish needed to think like an arrogant Londoner who believed he owned the wild. Pendleton wouldn't have placed a trail camera deep in the treacherous bogs where a true Highlander would walk. He would have put it somewhere obvious, somewhere he considered an official entry point to his newly acquired domain. As Hamish crested the first major rise, scanning the landscape, the rhythmic thud of hooves on soft turf broke the mountain silence. He paused, shading his eyes against the glare. A magnificent dapple-grey hunter was picking its way down the slope, ridden with effortless grace by a woman whose blonde hair was tucked neatly under a velvet riding hat. Priscilla Halberton Smythe, the daughter of the local hotelier and landowner, looked as though she had been perfectly sculpted from the icy Highland air itself. "Morning, Hamish!" Priscilla shouted, bringing her horse to a gentle halt. Her sharp blue eyes swept over his uniform. "I could hear the sirens all the way from the estate. And word at the village shop is that Blair is threatening to arrest half the county. Has someone finally murdered that dreadful Pendleton man? News travels faster than a falcon around here, Priscilla," Hamish replied, adopting a slightly sheepish grin, though his heart did its usual, irritating little flutter at the sight of her. "Aye, he's dead, tangled in his own fencing. Mr. Blair is entirely convinced Willie MacLean did it over a sheep grudge." Priscilla let out a delicate, perfectly bred snort of derision. "Willie, don't be absurd. Willie would have just stolen the fence and sold it in Strathbane. Pendleton was a fool, Hamish. He came to dinner at my father's house 2 nights ago and spent the entire evening bragging about his security measures. Treated the Highlands like it was a gated community in Surrey." Hamish's ears pricked up, though he kept his hands deep in his pockets and kicked lazily at a tuft of grass. "Security measures, you say? Would that include cameras?" "Of course," Priscilla said, adjusting her leather reins. "He boasted that he was going to catch the locals trespassing. My father tried to tell him that a camera on the moor is useless, unless you know where the deer trails are, but Pendleton insisted he had it covered. He said Head mounted his state-of-the-art equipment right on the old stone pillars where the drover's road meets his property line. He actually thought poachers would use the main path." Hamish suppressed a triumphant smile. An Englishman's arrogance was a reliable thing. "The old drover's road," he murmured, looking toward the distant crags. "Well, that was terribly clever of him. I suppose I should be getting back down to direct traffic before Mr. Blair bursts a blood vessel." Priscilla looked at him closely, a knowing glint in her eye. She knew Hamish's lazy act better than anyone in Lockdub. "Yes, inshore traffic is your primary concern right now. Don't let Blair ruin everything, Hamish. And do try not to get yourself killed. Good day." With a click of her tongue, she urged her horse forward, continuing down toward the village. Hamish watched her go for a brief moment before turning sharply toward the old drover's road. He moved quickly now, keeping low behind the rocky outcrops. The old stone pillars Priscilla had mentioned marked a boundary that hadn't been strictly observed in a century, standing like lonely sentinels against the sweeping sky. As he approached the crumbling stonework, Hamish spotted it, fastened securely to the inner side of the right pillar, camouflaged slightly by a clump of dried moss, was a small olive-green rectangular box, a trail camera. Pendleton had indeed placed it exactly where any local would easily spot it, but exactly where a wealthy city man would expect an intruder to walk. Hamish checked over his shoulder. The moor was empty, save for a few grazing sheep. He reached up, his long fingers finding the clasp. With a satisfying click, the camera came free. He popped the side panel open. The small memory card was still snugly inside. He slipped the entire device into the deep, hidden pocket of his heavy uniform coat, giving Lugs a satisfied nod. They had the dead man's eyes. Now, Hamish just needed to find a way to look through them without DCI Blair catching him in the act. But as he turned to leave, his keen eyes caught something else, a flash of bright, synthetic pink fabric snagged on the thorny gorse bush directly beneath the pillar. Hamish knelt in the frost-crisped grass, his long fingers carefully plucking the vibrant synthetic fibers from the vicious thorns of the gorse. He rolled the thread between his thumb and forefinger, his hazel eyes narrowing against the biting wind. It was a completely unnatural, glaring shade of pink, a chemical hue that had absolutely no business existing on a rugged Scottish moor. It was an exact, undeniable match to the expensive waterproof coat currently wrapped around the trembling shoulders of Samantha back in the drafty conservatory of the Lochdub Hotel. Hamish let out a low, thoughtful whistle, the sound immediately snatched away by the breeze. He slipped the bright thread into the breast pocket of his heavy tunic, patting it flat. The terrified woman had sworn blind that she had been safely tucked away in the village since dawn, oblivious to Pendleton's fateful march into the fog. Yet there was physical proof that she had been creeping around the exact spot where the camera was hidden, right on the disputed boundary line. With a soft click of his tongue, Hamish signalled for logs to follow and began the descent back into the village. He avoided the main road, knowing DCI Blair's unmarked rovers would be prowling the tarmac like angry metal beasts. Instead, he took the steep, winding sheep trails that brought him out behind the low stone wall of the local curry house, the star of the Highlands. The air here was a sudden, glorious contrast to the freezing moor, thick with the rich, warming scents of toasted cumin, garlic, and frying onions. Hamish pushed open the scarred wooden back door without knocking, stepping into the chaotic warmth of the commercial kitchen. "Mr. Amin, a man who had long ago learned that feeding the local police constable was the best way to ensure his somewhat flexible licensing hours were ignored, looked up from a massive vat of simmering dal. He wiped his hands on a flowery apron, shaking his head at the sight of the lanky, wind-battered policeman. "You look half-frozen, Hamish, mister," Amin said, his voice a melodic blend of Glaswegian and Bengali. "Don't tell me that loudmouth detective from Strathbane has you out chasing ghosts on an empty stomach." "Worse than ghosts, mister." Hamish groaned, pulling out a rickety metal stool and collapsing onto it with a heavy sigh. "He has me standing in the mud. I don't suppose you could spare a cup of hot chai and perhaps a stray samosa for a dying man. And maybe a tiny favour?" "Mister," Amin chuckled, already reaching for a steaming copper kettle. "The tea and the food are free, Hamish. The favour depends entirely on what it is." He slid a chipped plate holding 2 golden, crispy vegetable samosas across the stainless steel prep counter, followed by a glass of dark, fragrant tea. Hamish chewed gratefully, letting the spices warm his chilled bones before casually fishing the olive-green plastic box from his deep pocket. He placed it on the counter, looking at it with an expression of mild, helpless confusion. "Well, I found this wee contraption dropped up on the hill. Looks like one of those fancy memory cards from a camera. I was wondering if I could borrow that shiny new laptop of yours for just a minute. I am terribly hopeless with modern technology, you see. I wouldn't know a gigabyte if it bit me on the ankle." "Mister," Amin wiped his hands again, his eyes gleaming with pride at the mention of his computer. He led Hamish into the cramped, windowless back office, sweeping aside a mountain of Spice invoices to reveal a sleek silver laptop. With practiced efficiency, he took the tiny memory card from Hamish's palm, slid it into an adapter, and plugged it into the machine. A folder popped up on the bright screen, filled with dozens of video thumbnails. "There you go, Hamish, mister," Amin said, tapping the screen. "Looks like motion-activated wildlife clips. Just click the ones at the bottom. Those are the most recent." Hamish thanked him, waiting until the restaurateur returned to his simmering pots before leaning closer to the screen. The lazy, vacant facade vanished from his face entirely. He clicked the second-to-last file, time-stamped at 2 in the morning. The grainy night vision footage showed the stone pillars illuminated in eerie green light. A figure tramped past, head bowed against the wind. It was Ewan Campbell, carrying a bundle of fishing nets. Ewan paused, glared directly at the hidden lens with obvious contempt, made a rude gesture with his free hand, and kept walking. Ewan had known the camera was there, but he hadn't touched it. Hamish clicked the final file, the one time-stamped at 6 in the morning, the exact time Pendleton had checked his phone and flown into a rage. The green night vision had been replaced by the hazy, grey light of dawn. The footage showed a figure frantically clawing at the loose earth directly beneath the right pillar. As the figure stood up, brushing dirt from their knees, the camera caught a clear shot of a bright, unmistakable pink hiking coat. It was Samantha, and she was clutching a small, mud-caked metal tin tightly against her chest, her face a mask of desperate panic. Hamish sat in the dim light of the back office, the blue glow of the laptop screen casting sharp shadows across his face. He watched the loop of Samantha's grainy image Aganathe way. She clutched that tin, as if it were a lifebuoy in a stormy sea. She hadn't been looking for Pendleton, she had been looking for whatever was buried beneath that stone pillar. And Pendleton, watching the live feed from his warm hotel bed, must have seen her. He wouldn't have been angry about a poacher, Then he would have been fueled by the high-octane rage of a man who realized his own companion was robbing him. "Everything all right, Hamish?" Mr. Amin called out from the kitchen, the rhythmic thud of a meat cleaver punctuating his words. "Aye, just fine, Mr. Amin," Hamish shouted back, his voice returning to its usual lazy lilt. He expertly ejected the memory card, slipped it back into his pocket, and closed the laptop. "Just a lot of deer and wind. Not much for the police to go on, I am afraid. Thank you for the tea, it's put life back into me." He stepped out the back door, lugs immediately jumping to attention. The sun was beginning its long, slow arc toward the western peaks, turning the loch into a sheet of beaten silver. Hamish knew he couldn't just walk up to Samantha and demand the tin. If she was desperate enough to be digging in the mud at dawn, she was desperate enough to bolt, and if she bolted, DCI Blair would likely run her over with a police rover in his haste to make an arrest. No, the situation required a bit more mooching. He made his way back to the waterfront, but instead of the hotel, he headed for the small, weathered cottage of Ewan Campbell. The fisherman was sitting on an overturned crate outside his shed, methodically mending a pile of dark green netting. He looked up as Hamish approached, his face a map of deep lines and salt spray. "If you're here to arrest me because that fat pig from Strathbane told you to, you'd best bring handcuffs that fit. Macbeth," Ewan grunted, not breaking his rhythm. "I heard they've got Willie in the cells. It's a disgrace." Hamish leaned against the shed wall, crossing one leg over the other and looking out at the bobbing boats. "Willie's enjoying the free sandwiches, Ewan. Don't you worry about him. I am more interested in that knot you showed me Onseth one for the heavy Atlantic swells. The one that doesn't slip no matter how much the sea pulls." Ewan stopped his work, his sharp eyes fixed on Hamish. "The netlock? Why would a village bobby be interested in a netlock on a Sunday afternoon?" "Because someone used it on the moor today," Hamish said softly, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "They used it to tie a titanium walking stick to a roll of orange fencing. It was a very neat job. Professional." Ewan let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I didn't kill him, Hamish. I wanted to. I'd have liked to throw him in the deepest part of the loch with an anchor for a necktie. But I didn't go back up there after I finished my rounds at 2 in the morning. "I know you didn't," Hamish said. "The camera saw you, but it also saw someone else. Someone in a pink coat digging a tin. You wouldn't happen to know what old Mac Gregor buried under that pillar before he died, would you? He was a friend of yours." Ewan went very still. He put the net aside and stood, his joints creaking. He looked around to ensure the shore was empty before leaning in close. "Mac Gregor was a smuggler in his youth, Hamish. Not drugs or anything filthy like that. Just high-end watches and jewellery from the continent. He told me once Head hidden his retirement fund on the boundary line because he knew no one would ever dare build there. Then he died sudden-like, and that Englishman bought the lot. And Samantha was his niece, wasn't she?" Hamish guessed. "She didn't come here for the fresh air. She came for the tin. And Pendleton caught her. He wouldn't have let her keep it," Ewan muttered. "He was a greedy soul. Head have claimed it as property found on his land." Hamish nodded, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together with a satisfying, if grim, thud. "I need your help, Ewan. Blair is going to charge Willie by nightfall. We need to set a trap, and I need someone who knows how to handle a rope without making a sound." He began to whisper his plan, the two men huddled together against the cold Highland wind. It was a plan that relied entirely on the arrogance of the outsider and the invisibility of the local. By the time he was finished, a grim smile had touched Ewan's weathered lips. "He'll be there," the fisherman said, "but you'd better make sure that Strathbane donkey doesn't see me, or he'll be the one in the cells." "Don't worry," Hamish drawled, pushing off the wall. "Mr. Blair is far too busy listening to himself talk to notice a couple of Highlanders out for a stroll." As Hamish left, his mind turned to the final confrontation. He had to draw the killer back to the moor, to the scene of the crime, and he had to do it before the sun vanished behind the mountains. He pulled his mobile phone from his pocket one Blair, frequently mocked for being an antiquated, dialed the number for the Lochdub Hotel. It was time to spread a little rumour. The hotel call was brief and masterfully vague. Hamish, pitching his voice into a high-pitched, nervous warble, spoke to the receptionist while he knew Samantha was lurking nearby in the lobby. He claimed to be a local hillwalker who had found a shiny gold watch near the orange fencing on the moor and intended to hand it over to the constable's office once Head finished his tea. He didn't need to name the location. The killer knew exactly where the struggle had occurred and exactly what might have fallen out of that mud-caked tin during the frantic scuffle. By the time the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Quillins, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, Hamish was already back on the moor. He wasn't sitting on a boulder this time. He was crouched low in a hollow of peat and heather, a few yards from the spot where Arthur Pendleton had breathed his last. Beside him, Luggs lay as flat as a rug, his chin resting on his paws, sensing the tension in his master's coiled frame. Ewan Campbell was positioned 30 yards upwind, invisible behind a curtain of gorse, a coil of heavy-duty nylon line in his gnarled hands. The light faded quickly, the Highlands reclaiming their shadows. The only sound was the mournful whistle of the wind through the dead grass and the distant, rhythmic shush of the loch. Then, the crunch of a boot on gravel. A figure appeared over the rise, moving with a desperate, stumbling haste. It wasn't the heavy, arrogant stride of Arthur Pendleton, nor the clumsy stomp of DCI Blair. This person moved with the frantic energy of someone who had everything to lose. As the figure reached the patch of disturbed earth where the orange fencing still lay in a heap, the moon drifted out from behind a cloud, illuminating the bright pink fabric of a waterproof coat. Samantha dropped to her knees, her hands clawing at the frozen ground. "It has to be here," she hissed to herself, her voice thin and ragged. It can't have fallen out, not after everything. She wasn't looking for a watch. She was looking for evidence of her motive. Hamish watched from the shadows, his heart thudding steadily. He saw her pull a small, heavy object from her pocket tin. She opened it, the metal glinting in the moonlight, and began frantically counting the contents. "Looking for something, miss?" Hamish's voice drifted out of the darkness, calm and conversational. Samantha shrieked, scrambling backward, the tin slipping from her fingers and spilling several glittering Rolexes into the heather. She stared into the gloom as Hamish slowly stood up, his tall, lanky silhouette looming over her. "It's a terribly cold night to be out scavenging," Hamish said, stepping into the moonlight. He didn't have his baton out, his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. And a terrible waste of a good walking stick, too. "Ewan tells me that a netlock knot is nearly impossible to break once it's set. Pendleton didn't stand a chance, did he? Not when he caught you stealing what he thought was his legal property. He was going to take it all." Samantha screamed, her face contorting into a mask of pure rage. The mousy, terrified woman from the conservatory had vanished. "It was my uncle's, my inheritance. Arthur didn't even know it existed until he saw me on that stupid camera. He came here and tried to wrestle it away from me. He called me a thief. Him! The man who was going to steal my life's fortune." "So you used his own stick against him?" Hamish murmured. "It must have been easy. He was so busy gloating he didn't see you loop the fence around his ankles. He deserved it." She reached into her coat, her hand closing around something heavy, titanium walking stick she had retrieved from the scene before the police arrived, or perhaps a heavy stone. She lunged at Hamish with a feral cry. In one fluid motion, Hamish stepped aside. "Now, Ewan." A line of nylon snapped taut across the path, invisible in the moonlight. Samantha's boots caught the cord, and she went flying forward, landing face first in the soft, damp peat with a heavy thud. Before she could scramble up, Ewan Campbell stepped out from the gorse, expertly dropping a heavy section of fishing net over her writhing form. "Easy now, lass," Ewan grunted, pulling the drawstring tight. "You're only making it worse for yourself." Hamish walked over, looking down at the tangled mess of pink fabric and netting. He felt no triumph, only a weary sadness. Another death in the Highlands, all for a handful of gold watches and a bit of disputed land. "Luggs, stay!" Hamish commanded. He pulled his radio from his belt, his thumb hovering over the button. He knew that the moment he called it, his quiet life would be under threat. Blair would want to know how a lazy village constable had outmaneuvered a CID team. He looked at Ewan, who was already beginning to melt back into the shadows, his part in the trap finished. "Go on, Ewan," Hamish whispered. "I'll take it from here." He waited until the fisherman was gone before pressing the button. "Station house? This is PC Macbeth. I had a little luck. I think the killer has just tripped and fallen right into my lap. You better send Mr. Blair up here. Tell him to bring the handcuffs and maybe a thermos of tea. It's a long walk." The headlights of the police rovers cut through the darkness like twin daggers as DCI Blair stumbled up the final incline, his breathing a series of ragged, wet gasps. Behind him, Sergeant Anderson and two uniformed officers followed, their torches dancing over the heather. When the beams finally landed on the scene, they found Hamish Macbeth sitting comfortably on a rock, calmly sharing a sandwich with Luggs. A few yards away, Samantha lay pinned beneath a heavy fishing net, her face pressed into the peat, still snarling muffled curses. The spilled contents of the Tina fortune in gold and jewels twinkled mockingly in the torchlight. Blair stopped, his face transitioning from a sweaty pallor to a deep, dangerous plum. He looked at the prisoner, then at the treasure, and finally at Hamish, who was currently picking a stray piece of lint off his tunic. "What is the meaning of this, Macbeth?" Blair roared, though the effect was somewhat diminished by his need to lean heavily on his knees. "I had the Maclean fellow in the box." He was seconds away from cracking. "Oh, I'm sure he was, sir," Hamish drawled, standing up and adopting his most humble, apologetic posture. "Willie does love to talk, but I was just out here following your orders, sir, directing the traffic, as you said when this poor lady came charging out of the dark. She tripped over a bit of old rope left by the poachers and started shouting about murders and watches. I thought it best to hold her here for a real detective to handle." Blair squinted at the fishing net, then at the glittering Rolexes. He moved toward Samantha, his eyes widening as he realized the magnitude of the recovery. This wasn't just a village squabble, it was a high-profile smuggling bust. He could already see the headlines in the Strathbane Gazette. "A stroke of pure, dumb luck," Blair hissed, though a gleam of predatory ambition had entered his eyes. He straightened his tie and puffed out his chest. "If I hadn't pushed you to stay on the moor, Macbeth, she'd have slipped right past us. It takes a certain level of strategic placement to flush out a killer like this." "Aye, sir," Hamish agreed, his voice thick with simulated admiration. "It was a brilliant bit of positioning on your part. I'd never have thought of it. In fact, when the press asks how the local police managed to catch a cold-blooded killer and recover a smuggling cache in under 12 hours, I'll be sure to tell them it was all due to the Blair method of saturation patrolling." Blair's anger vanished, replaced by a smug, oily smile. He looked at Sergeant Anderson. "Did you hear that, Jimmy? Take notes. The Blair method. Well process the scene and take the prisoner in. Macbeth, get that filthy dog out of here and go back to your station. I'll handle the paperwork and the interviews." "Thank you, sir," Hamish said, tipping his cap. "I'd hate to be bothered with all those forms and the television cameras. It sounds awfully exhausting." As the Strathbane team began the noisy work of documenting the arrest and hauling a screaming Samantha toward the cars, Hamish whistled for lugs. He didn't look back. He melted into the darkness of the Highlands, his long, easy stride carrying him away from the chaos and toward the silence of Lochstub. An hour later, the police station was quiet. The fire in the small hearth was crackling softly. A pot of thick, peaty stew was simmering on the stove, filling the room with a scent far superior to the cold wind of the moor. Hamish sat in his favourite armchair, his boots off, a steaming mug of tea in his hand. Lugs was already fast asleep, his paws twitching as he chased imaginary rabbits in his dreams. The telephone on the desk gave a sharp, intrusive ring. Hamish looked at it for a long moment. It was likely headquarters, or perhaps a reporter, or even Priscilla calling to offer her congratulations. He reached out, his hand hovering over the receiver, then slowly withdrew it. He got up, walked to the wall, and unplugged the cord from the socket. Lochstub was at peace. Willie Maclean was no doubt being released from the cells with a few stolen police biscuits in his pocket. The Sassenach threat had been neutralised, and DCI Blair was currently making a fool of himself in front of a microphone in Strathbane, ensuring that no one would ever dream of promoting the lazy Constable Macbeth to a position of higher responsibility. Hamish ladled a generous portion of stew into a bowl, sat back down, and let out a long, contented sigh. The mountains were still there, the loch was still deep, and for at least one more night he was exactly where he belonged,